Hey Dunchbags, what's going on? It's Landon Remixes here, and welcome to my third dubstep review in a row. This is going to be of the debut album from Teminite. This is called Inception. Now, dubstep has always kind of been a little bit of a weird genre in terms of putting out full albums. Let's say Skrillex, for example, put out a very successful debut album, Recess, just a couple years ago, and Barely Alive did a really good job with their debut as well last year because they were two artists that could diversify their albums enough to make a pretty solid debut, and something that didn't sound as redundant as some of their former EPs. Teminite has been one of those artists that have steadily put out single after single after single, mostly being bangers, and I didn't really know what to expect come when this album dropped. Now, I can definitely say I've always been a fan of Teminite ever since his early days with some of his early dubstep singles, and it's definitely been awesome to see him grow as a producer, but I still at the same time feel like he could be pushing boundaries a little more than he is. And that's kind of what I was hoping he was going to do with his debut album, really diversify it a lot. And honestly, when I heard the trailer for this album, I wasn't extremely excited just because it didn't sound extremely diverse, which is going to really be what makes a dubstep producer's album really awesome. Some people in the Monster Cat community may know Teminite from his remix of Pegboard Nerd's Hero, which was the leading and winning remix from that remix competition, which was released on Monster Cat, which really gave him a boost in popularity. Not to say he wasn't already a great dubstep producer, because he was, but that really shone a light on his abilities as a producer, especially since the remix of that track was primarily elements from his own music and just a teeny tiny bit of the original track, which made it for a pretty unique remix. The thing about this album is that it has me caught in two very different places. One being that half of this album sounds like a kind of a rerun of the same track. I don't want to say that completely because there is a bit of diversity in, I'll just throw it out and say, the first half of this record. And the second half of this one is a little bit more experimental and seems very distant from where the first half is going. So I don't really know what to take from this. Not to say there aren't any bangers on the second half, because that would be a lie. Tracks like Get Down are absolutely huge on the second side in terms of just being a really hard bassy track. And this is very evident, especially by the fact that the only vocal appearance on this album comes from Jonah Hitchens, who appears in both of the last two tracks, which I thought was a little bit odd, especially when I first heard the preview of this album. And of course, because these tend to stick out a lot more than the rest of the tracks in the album just because of the vocals, these two tracks were two of my favorites. Step Into the Light is just very groovy. It has a lot of saxophone in it, which I thought was awesome, which doesn't really appear in the rest of the record. And Every Time I Look Into the Sky features some of those elements, but then takes it to almost really sound like a pop track, which I thought was really interesting and definitely a step forward for Teminite. Sadly, these are the two least popular tracks on the album, even though I feel like these were pushing boundaries that the rest of the album really wasn't doing, which is a bit sad, but I guess not everyone who's a fan of Teminite really wants to hear that sound. A lot of people want to hear the really hard sounds that the first half is bringing, especially on the track Inception, the title track, which I thought was probably one of the best appearances on this thing. This thing is nuts, all over the place, has two very distinct drops from one another. This track, I feel like, is kind of the result of Teminite's productions over the last few years. This is the kind of thing that I wanted to kind of be a one and done deal on the album. Like, he threw it out, this is what he's been doing, and this is kind of lead into his album. But sadly, that sound kind of carries through a couple more tracks, especially on tracks like Stormbringer, which sound a little bit more generic and kind of your standard dubstep sound. This would have sounded really good a couple years ago. It sounds kind of odd to hear the same style repeated in this age when dubstep has evolved so much as a genre. As evidenced in the artwork of the album and by the fact that you can hear so many melodies kind of carrying in the back of this thing, you can tell that Teminite clearly has a passion with melodies, especially evident when it comes to the end of the album. And we get this, I'd probably kind of say, sounding Aspiration, which is a tropical house jam, which I thought was really odd to fit in the end. I would have liked to hear him stepping boundaries a little bit more in this album using tracks like this. It wasn't one of my favorites, it was just kind of odd to hear, and it made it a little bit more diverse. Other than that, you can kind of hear these melodies carrying through the background of these dubstep tracks, which I really liked, and kind of carries what Teminite's always been about in the background of his music. On the other hand, we get the VIP of Spider, which is one of his oldest tracks. Spider is 3 to 4 years old at this point, and it was kind of cool to hear a remake of this. I'm gonna put this one in my favorites list just because it's so cool to hear this song remade in such a modern day setting. If you listen to the original and this one side by side, you can definitely hear a comparison of where Teminite started and where he is now. It's just awesome to hear those two back to back to back to back to back. The kind of direction the VIP is taking reminds me a little bit of Fire in the Hole by Pegboard Nerds, who is clearly one of his main inspirations with this project. On the first half, there honestly aren't a lot of tracks here that are very memorable, but then we get into the second half, which is by far my favorite part of the album. I already mentioned Get Down, which takes a little bit more of a glitch hop sound. Of course, overall that genre has always been really funky and jumpy throughout. Then we get to Night Drive, which it was funny because I actually had planned to review the Undertale soundtrack a long time ago, and when I heard this song, it sounded to me like, I think it's called Spider Dance. And because the melody on this one and the style that it was written in really reminded me of that, I actually asked Teminite himself if it was inspired from Undertale, and he said it was, which I am much happier with, of the fact that he kind of took that inspiration for this track rather than just kind of hiding that. I thought it was a really fun track and definitely reminiscent of the fun times I had with that game. And really, I already covered the rest of the tracks on this album, but like I said, with the second half we're getting a lot more diverse. With the first half we're really not, and I'm not really sure what to take from this album in a lot of places. I'm really torn on what I should say about this thing. I really love it in some places, I really don't in others. I don't think there are really a lot of bad appearances on this thing, just more forgettable appearances, I guess you could say. I really like to see where Teminite's pushing boundaries with this thing, and I would have liked to see him do that a lot more on this debut album, which is why I can't give it an extremely high rating today. But I think overall he has cemented himself quite a bit with a debut album, kind of covering all the different sounds that you've heard before in Teminite's music, retranslated to make a debut. And then for the kind of second half, looking toward the future of his music and kind of saying, okay, this is where we're going to be heading, and maybe into a more experimental direction, which I'd love to see from him. Hopefully that is the case. It's taken him quite a long time to put out this debut album, so I'm not sure if he's going to do another album like this, but hopefully he will, and hopefully we'll see him really stepping some boundaries with this because he is a really good producer. I'm gonna go ahead and give this one a 4.5 today. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this review, and sorry about all the freaking dubstep that I've been putting out lately. There should be some really out-of-the-park reviews coming fairly soon that I'm actually going to film right after this one, so hopefully I'll get those out soon to you guys. Anyway, let me know what you think in the comments about this album if you have listened to it. If you haven't, I have the stream link, so go and do that, and let me know what your favorites are. Anyway, I'm Landon Remixes, and I'll see you guys later. Peace.